Okay, so welcome everybody to our today's online panel here organized by the Heinrich-Böll Foundation together with and in cooperation with Access Now on the very important issue of online censorship in Iran, how to empower digital rights of activists on the ground, which of course we all know is an essential question to the ongoing activities of activists in Iran fighting for their rights. As Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we stand in solidarity with the protesters in Iran who are risking their lives for self-determination and human rights. At the same time, we strongly condemn the repression and violent actions of state authorities. What we have observed in the last weeks is a truly feminist revolution that shows us again the suppression of women, and the headscarf obligation is only the tip of the iceberg to it, is at the core of the Islamic Republic's authoritarian system. As Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we want to use our networks to give the demands and analysis of activists, academics, and journalists in Iran and from the Iranian diaspora the stage they deserve. This is as well the idea of today's event. Internet-based communication is key for those people who demonstrate in the streets of various Iranian cities. It's important for the coordination of activists, for campaigning, and their outlet to the world. And we all know that public debates in Germany, in Europe, and other countries around the globe very much rely on reports, photos, and videos that make it out of Iran. Without these pictures, it would be much more difficult to maintain media reporting and debate. And public debate and international is not an add-on. It is one of the strongest kind of protection we can give right now. For all these reasons, access to internet and social media platforms is crucial. It is worrisome to see how the Iranian regime, but as well as other countries like Russia and China, use internet censorship to suppress critical voices. And that's what we want to talk about today in this seminar. I'm happy to be here with you all, and I would like to listen to you in order to better understand that what we can do here in Germany and also all around Europe to strengthen digital rights in Iran. And there are some key messages which we have to talk about, which is first, of course, that digital rights are human rights. And in particular, the Iranian regime's online repression is a powerful reminder of the importance of digital rights for citizens and activists in Iran and around the world. The EU and its member states should step up their efforts to protect digital rights and to pursue government orchestrated internet shutdowns as human rights violations. This applies to Iran, but of course also to other countries restricting digital rights of their citizens. Germany and the EU need to impose targeted sanctions on individuals and companies that are involved in developing and implementing the Iranian regime's internet censorship. With regard to the case of the Iranian company Arvin Cloud that still operates with a sub-company from Germany, we should check urgently whether the existing sanctions against Iran allow the company to be prevented from operating in Germany. If this is not the case, new targeted sanctions would have to be imposed. And then setting legal standards, of course, for private companies, such as media platforms. The current protests in Iran show as well how important privately owned social media platforms are for social society and activists in countries without free press. Against this background, it is crucial that big tech firms live up to their responsibility vis-à-vis human rights defenders and democratic activists. For example, by improving content moderation and providing focal points that activists can approach in local languages. And it's, of course, as well, the responsibility of the European Union and the US to set standards for this that Facebook and others have to comply with. Last but not least, invest in technical solutions. As for how to empower digital rights of activists on the ground, the West could try and support access to better proxies for people inside of Iran and invest and research in long-term censorship circumvention techniques. These technical solutions, however, do not substitute political work, which we also want to discuss about today. I thank you all for participating in this seminar. I welcome you very much again to it, and I'm looking forward to now the experts, to listening to them and to listening also to your discussions as participating people here around. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, for your introductory remarks. I guess you have really prepared the ground for our discussion very well. And maybe for those who haven't realized, so Jan Philipp Albrecht is the president of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and he served also for almost 10 years as member of the European Parliament and used to work a lot on civil rights in the digital age. So he's really, like in the European context, has been working a lot on digital rights. So welcome, good evening from my side. My name is Bauke Baumann and I'm a senior policy advisor of the MENA department of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Berlin. I will moderate today's event and I'm very happy that you're with us today for the discussion on online censorship of the Iranian regime. Another big thank you goes to our distinguished panelists. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And of course, also to our partner Access Now, with whom we are co-organizing this event. Access Now is specialized on digital rights. And so I'm very happy to have you with us, to have Felicia Antonio on the panel representing Access Now. So this is really great. Now it's been almost 8 weeks that the protests in Iran erupted. Since then, women alongside men are protesting in all regions of the country. They ask for freedom, dignity, equal rights, but as well for a change of the regime. Some call it even a revolution in the making. And yeah, let's see what it will give. What we can already tell now that the regime's response to the protests is brutal and violent. Hundreds have been killed, thousands have been arrested. And of course, the internet is repeatedly shut down. Websites and internet services are deliberately blocked. And this is what we want to look at more closely today, the systematic online censorship, the digital repression of the regime. We aim to understand how the internet censorship is working. And of course, we'll discuss how digital rights and freedoms of citizens and activists in Iran could be empowered. We will discuss these questions with our speakers on the panel and open later on the discussion as well for questions and comments from the audience. So feel free to already write your questions during the discussion of the panel in the Q&A tool. We will come back to it later, and later on I will give these questions to the panelists so that also you can interact directly this way with the panel. I'm very happy to present to you our speakers. First of all, I would like to present to you Gisu Nia, who is the director of the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council. So welcome, Gisu. She is a human rights lawyer and serves as board chair of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. And she started her career in The Hague, where she worked on war crimes and crimes against humanity trials at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Court. Great that you are here. Secondly, I want to introduce Mahsa Ali-Madani. Mahsa Ali-Madani is a scholar at the University of Oxford and a senior researcher on freedom of expression online with Article 19, a human rights organization based in London. She has been working for years on the internet censorship of the Iranian regime, and I'm very happy to have her for today's event. So welcome, Mahsa.
Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, I would like to introduce Felicia Antonio from Access Now. She works as a campaigner for the Keep It On campaign, which is a global campaign that fights against internet shutdowns, not only in Iran, but all around the world. Before joining Access Now, she was a program associate at the media program, at the Media Foundation for West Africa, where she coordinated the African Freedom of Expression Exchange. Welcome, Felicia. So this is our
Thank you very much.
panelists. And I would like to start our discussion with Gisunia, who has a bit of a cold today. Thank you for being there anyway, really appreciate it. And maybe I would like to start with looking a little bit at the protest itself before we go to the online censorship. So now, 8 weeks after the protests erupted, I would like to know from you, where do you see the protests now, and what makes them different from previous protests that we have seen in the last couple of years? Because I think this is also important to understand maybe really the quality of these protests. So the stage is yours.
Thank you for having me, and yes, apologies for my voice. So there have been recurring protests in the country since December 2017. Some of those protests were triggered by a range of factors: the extremely bloody state crackdown on peaceful protests in November 2019. Those protests were initially triggered by a sudden removal of subsidies on gas, which led to a spike in gas prices. And after that, there's been other kinds of protests, some in certain provinces related to water shortages and things like that. But what we would quickly see with all of those protests is that despite the initial catalyst and what that was about, they would quickly translate into very strongly anti-government protests with anti-government slogans. What we've seen with these protests that have been going on for nearly 2 months now is that they began because of a core social demand. They began because of this absolute outrage at the fact that Mahsa Jina Amini was killed in the custody of the morality police, and over something as seemingly benign as having a few strands of hair basically showing and not being in compliance with the Islamic Republic of Iran's extremely strict mandatory hijab laws. So really these core feminist demands were animating these protests early on. And so that's what's been different, I think, in character from some of the previous protests that we've seen. Also the duration. And the fact that while with those prior protests, there certainly was a willingness to defy the state and to be very open in that, we see now, girls as young as 12 defying the mandatory hijab laws and protesting and singing protest slogans. So it's caught on in a way that will be very difficult for the state to bottle up again. So we now see that the Islamic Republic is going to crack down heavily on protesters. Different MPs, a huge group of hundreds of MPs got together to say that protesters should be executed. We're hearing terrible reports of custodial torture and getting ready to sentence protesters for being mohareb, or basically acts that would bring the death penalty in Iran. So we see that a crackdown is imminent and readying, and the international community should be very, very concerned about that and undertake any efforts it can to prevent that from happening. But the sentiment that has been released in Iran is something that will be very difficult for the state to bottle up again. Dictatorships thrive on a culture of silence, on fear, and the youth, and really all segments of society, young and old, across socioeconomic status, have shown that they're not scared. So I think that's what's distinct about this current spate of protests.
Thank you so much for giving us this bigger picture on the protest. Maybe just one small follow-up question to you. So to you, like, what role does online communication play for the protest, or how important is internet-based communication for the evolution and the development of these protests?
So I think that there's different components to what the online space can do in terms of public mobilization. And then there is another piece that relates to global awareness and also accountability. So I think on the accountability piece, I'll be happy to discuss that a bit later in this talk for the way that it's important. But in terms of the online space, one of the key things is that during November 2019, when there were wholesale disruptions in internet, and when that went on for 10 days and up to 2 weeks in some areas of Iran, it was very difficult to get any video footage of what was happening in terms of a violent crackdown on protesters. That serves an evidentiary value. So a lot of that sort of open source information is what would go to support prosecutions against alleged perpetrators that are perpetrating this repression and this violence. So that's a huge base of evidence that would not be accessible, and which the state purposely is ensuring is not accessible, so that there is no, basis upon which we can sort of put together these files for accountability purposes. But obviously there's a much bigger component of just public mobilization to this, with individuals in the country being able to connect around how they can coordinate to go to protests, plan protests, how they can coordinate on the aftermath of protests in terms of, if there are injuries and if they're unable to go to hospitals or scared to seek medical attention for fear of being turned over to law enforcement, those kinds of channels are also cut off. There's also a media component that would be missing. So especially with respect to global media, they really thrive on being able to use images, video, really tell a story of what's happening in Iran, because they would not be able to go inside the country and interview folks in the field. That's not going to happen. So it's really critical to have that sort of content to be able to inform a global community that is taking actions with respect to their foreign policy, and how that's situated vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic, and also deciding how best to support Iran's people. But happy to talk about the accountability aspect of that later, and what big tech should be doing, what others should be doing to ensure that that path stays open.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we will definitely come back to this accountability aspect later on in the discussion. So with this being said, I would like to pass over to Mahsa Ali Madani and focus more on the actual online censorship that is going on not only now, but since years in the in Iran. And of course, I suppose that most of the audience does not really know how this is actually going. So Mahsa, I would very much like to know, or maybe you could give us a very brief introduction on how does this online censorship of the Iranian regime work? And also in which way does it right now affect ordinary citizens, but especially also activists, just to get an idea what does this mean? Because it's not always that the whole internet is shut down, but partly it's for mobile internet, or it's only in certain regions. And maybe just to give us a better understanding of how this works and how this is affecting the people. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bauke. Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for having this event to center this, inspiring and horrifying I would like to say, revolution that's happening in Iran. And I'm really happy to be here with the range of speakers you've also arranged, Gisu really getting down into the human rights aspect of it. Of course, we cannot talk about technology and censorship without talking about what this means for human rights. And I'm so happy to be here with Felicia from Access Now, because the movement they've created with Keep It On is so central to the human rights cause in Iran in terms of understanding how digital rights is really so fundamental to human rights, especially in a context like Iran, where, as you said yourself, about, where free and independent media really does not exist. And so internet becomes so vital for so many different things. So I'm really happy to be here. But in terms of what we're seeing, I have to, and perhaps Felicia will be able to kind of contextualize this a little bit more, which is just how sophisticated Iran is in terms of its censorship and its information controls. And how these systems have really become built over the past decade, and going all the way back with the 2009 Green Movement. And, every time we've seen these protest crises in Iran, there has been a severe period of reflection. So, during the protests, we have the internet shutdowns, we have the censorship. And then afterwards, the regime has spent a considerable amount of time kind of developing new ways to make it more efficient and more robust. And so, of course, after 2009, we saw massive centralization of laws and institutions to really make the censorship regime much more sophisticated. And of course, in 2019, when we saw the week-long shutdown, there were a lot of lessons learned by the regime. And I believe one of the biggest lessons learned from, the shutdowns we saw in 2019, where, for over a week, as Gisu said, we saw disconnections from the international internet. There was massive economic losses to the country. And of course, the regime itself had a lot to lose from that. I believe, different partners and different digital rights organizations have set the estimates at so many billions of dollars from those shutdowns. And so there has been really a period of understanding how to make these systems much more efficient. And I believe the one thing we can point to between 2019 and the start of these protests that has really defined what's going on is a bill that has been sitting in Parliament. Of course, Access Now and a lot of digital rights organizations have been working on what this bill means for internet shutdowns and access to the internet. And this is, of course, the User Protection Bill, or Tarh Siyanet. And of course, the User Protection Bill, ironically, it does exactly the opposite of what the bill says, which is it tries to undermine the rights of Iranian users and makes them much more vulnerable to the state. And so a lot of draconian elements to this bill. And there has been massive opposition to the bill in Iran, to the point that even some very hardline and conservative elements in Iran have been opposed to it just because of the implications it would have for industry and business and things like this. So it never had the political will yet to be passed in, the existing hardline conservative parliament that we have right now. So the political will wasn't there for it to be passed. However, there has been quiet implementation of a lot of different elements of this bill. And we have been tracking and researching this at Article 19 in terms of the different elements we're seeing put into place. A lot of different elements we can talk about that I don't think we have space for right now at the bill, but the most concerning element is the part regarding VPNs in the bill. So the bill has tried to criminalize the use of VPNs, virtual private networks, proxies, to help circumvent the censorship that exists on the Iranian internet. And so the bill wants to criminalize the sale of VPNs and essentially build the technology to technically disable the use of VPNs across the network. So as far back as October 2021, not related to any protests or events, we started noticing massive disruptions and deterioration to the network health in Iran. and talking to different network engineers in Iran, trying to understand what was happening with various different VPNs, we started to understand that Iran was actually trying to deploy new software and new methods to actively attack and disable VPNs in a very sophisticated manner. And so this has been one of the major tools in the arsenal of the authorities that I think is really defining what's going on right now as one of the layers of internet disruptions and shutdowns. So bring us all the way now to September 2022, when, of course, Mahsa Amini was killed and the protests started, and we started seeing protest disruptions. We didn't see the, very, cutthroat shutdowns that we saw in 2019. We started seeing a mixed bag of different methods in terms of ways to disrupt access to the internet. And so, one of these methods right away was, the National Security Council came out and has temporarily blocked many, if not most, of foreign internet services like Instagram or WhatsApp. Basically, any kind of foreign internet service that would allow communication, even video games that allowed communication, have been blocked. But most importantly, they blocked the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. And this is very significant because these two stores are where users can reliably download, safe and secure proxies or virtual private networks. And so when much of the internet is censored, you need a whole host of different VPNs. And with the fact that they have been aggressively attacking and disabling VPNs, this has been a massive hurdle. And so, most Iranians have like 10 or 20 different VPNs on their phones at a time. And so they have been finding that they don't work. And so this becomes a massive hurdle to accessing the free or non-national internet. So this has been the first layer of censorship and censorship of VPNs. The second layer is what we have been seeing, which has been a pattern of mobile curfews. So, Iran, like many countries in the world, relies on connectivity to the internet, mainly through mobile data or smartphones. And so between the hours of 4 p.m. and 1 a.m., we have been seeing a pattern where the major mobile carriers have been either shut down or massively disrupted. Raitel, Irancell, Hamra Aval, the major mobile carriers have been showing patterns of these mobile curfews, which of course, my internet actually cut off. So Gisu might have already touched on this point, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating it, but those are the hours where, protesters are mostly out on the streets. So they've been ensuring that the internet is disconnected at those times. And lastly, the other pattern we have been seeing is severe attacks on provinces or regions where minorities exist. So provinces like Sistan and Baluchistan, where we have seen actual massacres occur since the beginning of the Mahsa Amini protests. I mean, today marked the 40 days of mourning since the massacre that happened in Zahedan in Sistan and Baluchistan, when forces actually ended up attacking a mosque and killing worshippers. Sunni Baluchi worshippers were killed. And so during that day, we had internet shutdown in Sistan and Baluchistan. We've also seen, and Felicia can probably attest to this, how we've been seeing regional shutdowns in Kurdistan and in Khuzestan. And so these are provinces where the most protest brutality we've seen from security forces against minorities, against protesters, have been occurring. And so we have actually been seeing those shutdowns, for a day or two in these regions. So these are the various different methods that kind of have evolved to sustain and define the digital repression we have been seeing during these protests, or revolution, as some of us might like to call it.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive picture. And it's, for someone who is not into, let's say, a tech person, it's really puzzling to see like how sophisticated this whole censorship machine is working. And I mean, maybe to just make it more tangible, that means like, every photo or video I can see on German or American Twitter from Iran is basically footage that is somehow sent via a still working VPN, if I'm not mistaken. So you have to find first a VPN to access then any kind of, I don't know, messenger service where you can still send your pictures or videos abroad. Is this correct, or is there basically other ways to send it in?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, most footage you're seeing has been enabled by a proxy service that can work. So whatever footage you're seeing, the person who it came through probably has put in time and effort to ensure that that connectivity was there.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So passing on to Felicia. So Iran is not the only country using internet shutdowns to silence critical voices or to build up an authoritarian regime. So there's more shutdowns around the world. Maybe you can tell us more a little bit about the global dynamic and about maybe which other countries beside Iran are using internet shutdowns as a deliberate strategy. And also if you see, I don't know, some particularities of the Iranian case. Is there something different? Are they just doing copycat what is already done in, I don't know, China or other places? So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to re-echo the importance of this conversation and to say thank you to all the panelists that have presented before me. Yeah, Mahsa has already mentioned how Iranian authorities have weaponized internet shutdowns, but sadly, this is not just happening in only Iran. Before I move on, I also want to speak about the way the internet shutdown happened in Iran, and the fact that Mahsa mentioned it wasn't just what we saw in 2019, but rather it started gradually and escalated very quickly. So in terms of what we are documenting around the world, just to give a global snapshot, many countries around the world are using internet shutdowns to silence voices. And most of the time, governments are the ones that impose internet shutdowns, not on any day, but during important national events, including elections, protests, conflicts, political turmoil, and even during school exams. And so that is what we are seeing in Iran. Protests start, and then authorities are quick to impose internet shutdowns in order to stop information from getting out of the country and preventing the rest of the world from knowing what is happening. So last year, for instance, Access Now and the Keep It On Coalition, we documented at least 182 cases of shutdowns in 34 countries. And sadly, that was a year we saw more countries imposing internet shutdowns since we began this work in 2016. And then, aside the fact that these countries have increased, we also saw new countries that had never imposed internet shutdowns also implementing the practice. So Senegal, for instance, Burkina Faso and South Sudan, as well as Eswatini did shut down the internet for the first time per our shutdown tracker optimization project database. So to re-echo, our monitoring over the years has shown that protests and political turmoil are the major triggers of internet shutdowns. And so last year we saw authorities in countries like Iran, Bangladesh, Chad, Cuba, India, Iraq, Myanmar imposing internet shutdowns to disrupt protests. And these shutdowns were even complete blackouts, which I would speak more about as the conversation unfolds. We've also seen that at least over 53 governments have used internet shutdowns as a tool, not only to thwart and disarticulate the protests themselves or the protest itself, but then also it enables authorities to cover up human rights violations that are commonly linked to security forces' brutality and crackdown on protesters. And this is because it makes it extremely difficult for human rights defenders, for journalists to be able to cover what is happening and report effectively on what is happening in the country. And we've seen a number of heinous crimes being perpetrated against protesters in Iran and in other places around the world. And this is particularly very common in authoritarian regimes or countries with very weak democracies. And then also, as Mahsa did mention, mobile internet disruptions are also becoming common. Last year, 18 governments did impose mobile internet shutdowns, including Iran, Iraq, Jordan, among many other countries. And the effect is really concerning when it comes to mobile shutdown, because in many developing countries, people rely on their mobile phones to access the internet. And so once you shut down mobile internet, to them it's actually equal to a complete internet blackout, because not many people are able to have access to fixed cable internet access. And then, and so at least we saw 37 incidents of mobile internet shutdowns in 2019, as compared to 15 in the previous year. And this is really, really a concern, and it's important for all of us to continue to raise awareness about this and to also highlight how these internet shutdowns are affecting people, affecting and violating fundamental human rights. So the Iranian government continues to weaponize internet shutdowns, which doesn't just aim to disrupt the protests themselves, but then also, as I said, it makes it difficult for us to be able to track and know what human rights violations are happening. And this enables these human rights violations to happen with impunity. Yeah, this is just the global overview of what we've seen in the last year. And then I think one thing that stood out when the protests began in Iran is the fact that we could see the shutdowns moving or escalating as the protests were spreading across Iran. And so initially, when they started in Saqqez, which is Mahsa Amini's hometown, the internet was disrupted there. And then as the protests expanded across the country, you could see authorities shutting down the internet or expanding the shutdown to those areas. And of course, Iranians have become really tech savvy when it comes to using circumvention tools, given the history of shutdowns in the country. And so authorities also began blocking dozens of secure applications, including virtual private networks. And as we are trying to find solutions through different platforms and services in order to enable people to come back online, the authorities are also becoming really innovative in ensuring that they impose internet shutdowns, and whatever objective they want to achieve is achieved effectively to their at their end. And I would just say that the scale, the scope, and the impact of the shutdown in Iran had one objective: to neutralize the protests and to stop people from speaking up against injustices perpetrated by authorities, and also to cover up the human rights violations perpetrated by security forces and other government officials against protesters.
Thank you very much, Felicia, for giving us a bigger picture and also linking it to the Iranian context. Now we heard already several times how internet shutdowns could be also perceived as a human rights violation itself. So I would maybe give this question to Gisu, just asking, like, would you consider the internet shutdown or censorship itself a human rights violation, or is it rather a means to hide other human rights violations happening in the streets so that people cannot report on it or wouldn't know about it? Like, because in the end, this will be also a question as more and more governments using internet censorship. Will this be something where, like, itself considered as a human rights violation that we fight, or is it more that we need this tool for transparency when it comes to other human rights violation? How do you see this, or how do you consider this?
So several years back, there was a decision, or rather there were UN experts that declared internet as a human right. And that's since been reinforced in court cases across the world and in different forums and in different human rights reporting. Now, the way that I see it is that the internet is core to the right of freedom of expression and also association and assembly. So because it's so deeply intertwined with how we communicate today in 2022, any stifling of that ability necessarily impacts those rights. So it's not that in the ICCPR, for instance, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that there is expressly part of the convention that's been amended to say you have a right to Wi-Fi. That's not exactly it, but we might get there. Actually, there's nothing that's not off the table, but though that is part and parcel of freedom of expression and the way that we move and communicate today. And so it is actually a core human right, and it is being violated, obviously, in Iran by the Islamic Republic, and has been before these protests in many different ways. So absolutely, that is part of it. What I will say from a practitioner standpoint is that I know that there is a move to engage with more UN bodies and working groups and submit petitions and requests to the Human Rights Committee and other bodies that would make decisions about digital rights and discussing that within a sort of traditional human rights framework. There could be a lot more work that's done in that way to really shore up, a series of precedents and to build some language around that. I think what I'm really concerned by and have been deeply concerned by since November 2019, when we saw this, massive shutdown of internet and the disruptions that Mahsa very clearly explained and that all the speakers have touched on, is what that online, that sort of, cover of offline darkness, basically, or online darkness, really, how that really helped facilitate the perpetration of atrocity crimes. And so that link for me is something that's really important to look at, because again, the way that we communicate in 2022 and the way that information is disseminated is so heavily reliant on the online space. And so taking that ability away has pretty profound impacts in terms of allowing states the cover that they need to sort of commit crimes with total impunity, with no way to actually record what happened. And so this is something that we still deal with respect to historical crimes. So when we look at, for example, the mass executions of thousands of political prisoners in Iran's jails in the summer of 1988, or rather in 1988, the way that we build a case there is very different than how we would do today. But because what judges would be expecting today is that there is that kind of open source information to rely on and to kind of piece together what happened. It makes the absence of that information so much more problematic than the absence of video content in 1988, because clearly not everybody there was no handheld device to be able to take those kinds of videos, decades ago. So that's my concern. Yes, it is a human rights violation, and it's closely linked to core human rights violations, but it also enables the perpetration of atrocity crimes when that use and access is disrupted, and especially because of the framework of which we communicate today. This would be less of an issue for a country that has less internet penetration as a starter, because the context there would be different. So for example, when we look at building accountability files in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's a very different approach to how one would build a case, because a lot of it will come from witness testimony. There's an expectation that there would be some ability to do field investigations, and obviously some crime sites, there is actually access given to crime sites. With Iran, because it's a completely closed society, because we're not dealing with a situation in which there's a hybrid court, as you would see in the DRC, we're completely reliant on a lot of this video and photo evidence to sort of piece together from different angles what that substantiates, and also to be able to interview witnesses, victims, and survivors inside the country through these electronic means. Of course, one can still have, regular telephone conversations, but really it's what we'd like to do is do that through interviews via video link, also because then you can assess demeanor, and there's a whole lot of other aspects to the information that one would collect when you're able to do a sort of face-to-face interview. So I'll pause there, but it has profound implications, not just as a violation, not just as a human rights that's being violated and connected to other core human rights, but also for what that lack of access does in terms of being able to substantiate these pretty serious allegations of atrocity crimes.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's indeed interesting to consider internet as part and parcel of freedom of expression and assembly in the 21st century, and as well to see the new role that all these kind of digital means now have in prosecution of any kind of atrocities and crimes against humanity, which we can tackle in the next round. I already saw that Mahsa wanted to come in on this, and I will give you the floor right now, and maybe I give you another question on top of it. So, because I was also wondering, talking a little bit about sanctions and what implication the international sanctions in place have or don't have for digital rights and freedoms, in a sense of course, they were meant to put pressure on the regime, but at least somewhere I also read that unfortunately it also helped execute some censorship measures by the regime, as maybe some international tech firms were not allowed or cautious to provide services in Iran. So maybe you could speak a little bit on this role of sanctions and how you see them, and good, bad implications, and then of course feel free to also react to what Gisu has said.
Yeah, so I guess that question is somewhat related to what I wanted to comment on, which was speaking about laws and international norms. Obviously, it's and like I said, what Keep It On has been doing in terms of really centering the right to internet and internet access as a human right norm has been very important and part of this broader movement that we're all part of. What I did want to reference, however, are kind of international norms and emerging laws that help empower regimes like the Islamic Republic. And so, I mean, there are many, and especially related to national security, because of course, whenever we have protests in Iran, whenever Iranians want to practice the right to freedom of expression, the right to protest, the right to assembly, it automatically becomes securitized in Iran. And so, if we go back to 2019 and we look at official statements in terms of how they were defining what was happening and how they justified the internet shutdowns, it was very much language of national security, very much language of preventing terrorism, because protesters are often defined as terrorists or foreign agents, etc. And so back in 2019, the Minister of ICT himself ended up referencing certain existing international norms and conventions that help justify what they were doing. So in the 2019 case, they referred to Articles 34 and 35 of the ITU, which basically says that in the ITU constitution, it says that telecommunication services can be blocked by states to prevent dangerous security situations that compromise the state. And of course, they use this. At the moment, there are several resolutions. I know Article 19 has been working on this resolution. And Access Now has been working on it, which is within the Security Council. At the moment, India, who is a member of the Security Council, is working on a resolution on new and emerging technologies and their role in terrorism. And of course, this is extremely dangerous, this kind of resolution, in terms of how, of course, countering terrorism is a legitimate concern and should be worked on. But obviously, this becomes a very gray area with states like Iran and India itself that mobilize national security and terrorism to justify denying the right to the internet and denying the right to protest, etc. So being mindful of not just the positive norms, but some of these negative norms that are, helping deteriorate this cause is also very important, and really important to be engaged on, especially as, this countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes is a resolution that's going to be tabled at the Security Council very soon and poses significant risks to the Keep It On movement, essentially. So I just wanted to highlight that as something that folks should be aware of in terms of how these other languages and norms can be used to harm what we're talking about. In terms of what you discussed about sanctions, so this has U.S. sanctions, U.S. technology sanctions, and this is specifically what we're talking about. The role that this has caused, the internet is really in the internet in Iran, and then the hindrances, and of course, again, colleagues at Access Now within Felicia's team, like Peter, Maisik, and Natalia, have been working on this issue a lot, and I have to give them credit because when Russia invaded Ukraine, obviously we saw systems of sanctions be placed on Russia in reaction to that situation. And of course, tech sanctions became a big issue. And right away, Access Now did some incredible work and worked with the U.S. Treasury to ensure that there was a personal communications and a general license put into place for Russia. So key internet services could continue to help empower Russian civil society, empower Russian freedom of expression, and ensure it's not blocked in Russia. So that was really important work, and it happened right away. And we were so impressed within, the Iranian digital rights community, because we have been working on this issue for 10 years. So those sanctions had been in place for 10 years, and we had been working to get the U.S. Treasury to update the general license to include a broader swath of internet services to allow them not to be blocked in Iran. And so what did this really mean? So going all the way back to 2013, the sanctions regime on Iran has existed for a very long time, always lessening the impact of sanctions on ordinary innocent civilians has been very important. And so the US Treasury created the General License on Personal Communications in 2013. It was slightly updated and expanded in 2014 to ensure that internet services that help empower freedom of expression and personal communications was allowed. Services like Twitter, like Facebook, American-owned services would be allowed to operate and not blocked, at least from the American side for Iran. Other services that kind of fit in within a more gray area were blocked. So services like, Google Cloud Platform that would help technologists host and maintain internet infrastructures were blocked. And so this really complemented what Iranian authorities were trying to do. So Iranian authorities have been trying to nationalize the internet in Iran, which is to get services and infrastructure to not rely on foreign platforms where they can't control the data, they can't do surveillance or monitoring, but to be hosted on national platforms where that centralized control could occur. So when things like Google Cloud Platforms or Amazon's AWS infrastructure was denied for a lot of Iranians, because these are key services for technologists and developers, Iranians often didn't have much choice, Iranian technologists, but to turn to the national alternatives. So in this environment where these services were denied, companies like Abra Arvan really thrived. And so I know Abra Arvan has become, a big topic of discussion in Germany because it does have a German entity. But, companies like that had monopolies because, the foreign alternatives were not available due to the tech sanctions. And so they really thrived in that environment. And of course, they have helped with the nationalization of infrastructure. They have many contracts and they actively cooperate with the state. So that has been, a very dangerous, repercussion in terms of complementing what the state wanted to do. Of course, with the outbreak of protests, I think it took less than a week or two for the U.S. Treasury to finally prioritize expanding the general license for tech services in Iran. And so cloud computing was added to what services could be expanded. So in reaction, a number of companies did come out and kind of announce what services of theirs they had now opened in light of the removal of the sanctions restrictions. Unfortunately, though, we haven't necessarily seen all the services become available. Like Google's cloud platforms are still not available in Iran because, of course, there's the added layer of complication because financial sanctions still remain in place. And what that means, of course, is that these services that rely on subscriptions and payments can't still be used unless, Iranians have access to foreign credit cards and circumvention tools to access the services. And really, from the perspective of civil society and human rights organizations like Article 19, our answer to that, hurdle is that these companies need to stop looking to Iran as a financial market. We're not going to likely see the removal of financial sanctions until this regime is gone, or some 360 change happens to the regime, which I highly doubt. So while financial sanctions are a reality, these companies need to look to Iran as not so much as a market, but start identifying and offering credits. I would call them internet freedom credits. So, legitimate technologists and civilians can start taking advantage of these kinds of tools and infrastructures, which can, of course, help with, building proxies and different kinds of tools and services that can help in the fight for circumvention, for example.
Thank you very much for giving this picture and also illustrating how unintentionally basically the US technology sanction played in the cards of the Iranian regime and their buildup of a national internet, which is basically now the basis for any kind of censorship, and also this role of the German subsidiary of Arvan Cloud, where the German newspapers Netzpolitik, Taz and Korrektiv did a great research on how basically for years this company in Germany helped Arvan Cloud to also build this national internet in Iran, which is indeed a scandal, and I hope this will be stopped. Passing it on to Felicia. So speaking of internet shutdowns, I assume that this also requires a technical expertise. We spoke already that the Iranian regime is building on all these kind of tools for years. So I'm wondering, like, where does all these expertise, not only in Iran, but also in other countries, come from? Like, is it private companies? Is this governmental agencies that have all these expertise? Is this Western companies? How are they maybe also learning from each other? What do you know about this?
Yes, governments tend to learn bad habits from each other. And when you look at countries that continue to impose shutdowns, you can see that the scope and the scale tend to intensify over the years. And so that is exactly what is happening. So the complexity of shutdowns varies widely based on the country where it is being imposed. And I think some years back, full internet shutdowns were very common. That is when there is no internet access at all. Governments just order ISPs to block internet access in the country. But now we see countries observing from what is happening in neighboring countries, and they believe that when they impose shutdowns, they can control political upheavals as well as suppress protests through these shutdowns. And so that is when you start seeing mobile shutdowns becoming a tool being used by governments. And sadly, as I indicated earlier, it targets poorer and existing marginalized communities when it comes to connectivity and internet access. And this is easier for governments to impose. We've also seen the use of throttling, where governments would reduce the internet speed, making it technically unusable. And so you can have like 3G network, but you're not able to send images or videos or any content via the internet. And it's also extremely difficult to be able to identify that throttling is happening. Sometimes you just think it's due to the quality of the internet, but then some governments do take advantage of this to impose internet shutdowns or control information flow in various countries. Yes, some companies like Bluecoat and Cisco have sold equipment to perpetrators of shutdowns directly, and this enabled them to be able to block platforms like Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp. So yes, private companies are also complicit when it comes to shutdowns, and it's important for us to engage them in this conversation. Also, technical tactics used by government are also becoming really complex, and at the same time as shutdowns are spreading across the world and now getting international attention, and circumvention tools are also becoming widespread. You see governments also expanding their censorship tactics to target these tools that are enabling people to come back online. And as we've seen in Iran, when authorities started blocking access to VPNs that would enable people to still share information. But then I think one thing that is important to note is the fact that the more innovative governments become in censoring people, people also become resilient and tend to use diverse ways to access or to come back online to using proxies. As Mahsa was explaining, the videos you would see online, it's somebody's commitment to ensure that the world sees what is happening. We've also seen techniques like deep packet inspection and denial of service attacks, and more, and as and this has increasingly made it even difficult for tech-savvy people to be able to navigate shutdowns. But I think we need to appreciate the fact that people continue to remain resilient and determined in coming back online. And in as much as we've not been able to find a solution to, let's say, bypassing complete internet blackouts, I think when you look back and where we are now, I think it's important to underscore that people, the technologies in the community, the various governments that support the work that we do, and also just the civil society solidarity has really made us more stronger and powerful in pushing back against internet shutdowns. And it has also empowered us to be able to detect some of these shutdowns that previously were really, really difficult to even know that they are happening. And with us raising awareness about what is happening, you get people being vigilant. And once there is more like a disruption in the service they are used to, so they are uploading something online and it's not working, the first thing they do is to check with their neighbors. Are you experiencing the same thing? And so if this is like widespread, and then we know that, of course, this is an intentional act by the government or authorities to prevent information from coming out of the country. So these are some of the ways that governments are becoming technically inclined in shutting down the internet. But then at the same time, it's really sad that once a government shut down the internet, I think the likelihood of them repeating is very high. And those around such countries also tend to impose these shutdowns when similar situations are happening in the country. Yeah, so these are some of the ways that I would recommend. And yeah, I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's I find it frightening, this vision of more and more countries using these tools. And at the same time, as you said, it shows how important digital rights are, and it shows how important it is to build alliances and really to advocate for these freedoms also online. This is very much the freedoms that we need to have. I would like to come to our last round on the panel, and I would like to encourage all the people following us to, if you have questions to our panelists, please use the Q&A tool, write it down, and after this round, I would take up your questions and address them to the speakers. So feel free to use it. And so in this last round, we want to talk a little bit about solutions, if there are solutions, or at least entry points for things that we can do on different levels. And now I want to come to Gisu, and knowing that your expertise is especially on litigation accountability, and that you are also leading this strategic litigation project at the Atlantic Council, I would like to ask you, how this regime could be held accountable, maybe not now, but later on, and what can the international community do right now? Because also here in Germany, you sometimes feel like politicians are shrugging their shoulders and say like, but what lever do we have? And sometimes you feel this is also just easy to just not do more, and probably there is ways that you could already prepare the ground at least for prosecutions later on, and I am sure you can tell us more about this.
Definitely. I mean, part of the reason why I was very interested to come and speak to this audience is because of your foundation being in Germany and the critical role that the state of Germany plays in international criminal justice, in universal jurisdiction, and also in their role in the UN system. So what could happen immediately is a special session of the UN Human Rights Council to discuss these ongoing protests and the violence, and to discuss the imminent executions and the internet shutdowns and all of it. Germany has announced its intention to call this special session. They are going to co-chair it with Iceland. We really thank Germany for their leadership in that regard, but there's a bit of an issue around the timing, because they've announced their intention to call this special session, but because the Universal Periodic Review is happening in these weeks, it might have to be a lunchtime session per the rules. Then there was talk that it would happen the week of November 17th. And really, I just want to urge that anybody who's in the audience who has contacts with government officials who would maybe speak to the Germany's mission to the UN, just strongly encourage that this needs to move forward with strength, that the state of Germany also needs to properly démarche and call on its allies and other member states that it works with at the UN to ensure that not only does the special session move forward, but that any outcome of the special session is voted on at the level that we need. And so what do I mean by that? Well, the purpose of the special session and what civil society organizations and what those inside Iran who are working on these issues want is the setup of a UN investigative mechanism. And that would actually do a lot of the legwork of what I was discussing earlier in terms of us having challenges with obtaining video content that shows violations and other content that needs to be properly analyzed. So there's an issue of collection, but there's also an issue of the proper collection, preservation, and analysis. And a UN investigative mechanism would do that. And it would be an independent, impartial, international investigative body that would do that. So we really need that creation. And we know Germany has played a very strong role on that, but we would be encouraging that they continue to play that role and they also work in coordination with their allies. Sometimes these meetings are convened, but then we see that there are states from other regional blocs that haven't necessarily been properly briefed on the issues, or are coming, with questions that do not reflect the reality on the ground in Iran, or are not really on board with the ask. And so I think Germany and its allies plays a critical role there. I'll touch on two other quick things with respect to Germany, which is that Germany obviously has a very expansive universal jurisdiction framework. By universal jurisdiction, I mean that for a criminal prosecution, there does not need to be any territorial or nationality link to the country. And so that's why we see, for example, different war crimes trials involving the conflict in Syria that happen in German courts. And that's where the alleged perpetrators, and then some of those who've been convicted, are Syrian, that the victims are Syrian and the acts actually occurred in Syria. So really there's very little link to Germany, but the decision is that crimes against humanity, war crimes, that these crimes are on such a level that they should really be prosecuted anywhere. In Germany, there have been different submissions made to German prosecutors over the years to either issue arrest warrants for alleged Islamic Republic of Iran perpetrators that have entered Germany for medical treatment and for a range of other reasons. There are different judges who are responsible for torture, surveillance, execution sentences for juveniles, as well as sentences for so-called morality crimes, who've all been to Germany over the past decade. And the legal submissions that I and others have made were never resulted in arrest warrants, and some of these judges eventually fled, were killed, maybe allegedly committed suicide under very suspicious circumstances. The point is that they've all evaded justice. They've returned back to Iran. Somebody who was head of the judiciary and committed unspeakable crimes eventually died in Iran, never having faced justice, never even having had an arrest warrant issued or an indictment issued. So what I would ask the German authorities, because some of this sometimes is a political decision, although I appreciate that Germany's judiciary is independent, and that is excellent, and so is the prosecutor's office, and obviously that's strong rule of law, and that's great. There are some political considerations that factor into whether or not these individuals are arrested. So what I would say is that right now we're getting reports of mid to lower level perpetrators who are allegedly leaving Iran or planning to leave Iran. I can't say that those reports are yet verified, but should we find ourselves in a place where a low-level perpetrator who had some responsibility and maybe ordered the torture of detainees or is engaged in other acts that could be criminalized under Germany's laws, that there would be attention paid to issuing arrest warrants and bringing them into custody, and that this should not be something that is shied away from, or that there would be concerns about resources, time, and the others that would factor into them not being brought into a courtroom, essentially. The very last thing I'll say is that there is a means by which structural investigations can be launched. And so what that means are investigations that don't need to have any named perpetrators. So we wouldn't need, under German law anyway, you can issue an arrest warrant for anybody, even if they're not present in the territory of Germany. But putting that aside, typically arrest warrants are only issued for those that would have some link to the country or are going to come back or would be present for trial. With the situation of a structural investigation, you don't actually need the named perpetrators to be able to launch that structural investigation. Currently, there are structural investigations on Syria, on Ukraine, and for ISIS crimes. And that's in Sweden, Germany, and France, and in other jurisdictions that have picked that up. The structural investigations look at structures. So it's in the name. Basically, they're looking at how all these pieces apply. And then if there's ever an alleged perpetrator that comes into the territory who could actually show up for trial, then you have a situation that's ready to go. And there would never be a concern where there isn't the evidence that is there. The prosecutor wouldn't have qualms about quickly issuing an arrest warrant if all the prep work has been done. So I think given the severity of what's happening in Iran and the fact that hopefully we will soon have a UN investigative mechanism set up, and the fact that Germany is playing a very strong leadership role there and has played a very strong leadership role when it comes to universal jurisdiction, I would love to see structural investigations launched on the situation in the territory of Iran, keeping in mind that a lot of mid to lower level perpetrators may at some point leave, and these trials would need to be quickly launched.
Thank you so much for giving us some concrete avenues to work on accountability. And this is, first of all, I hope that people in the audience will pick up your advice, but of course, this will be also something that we as Heinrich-Böll Foundation in our talks with government officials will bring up. And I really hope that, be it like the cases against Syrian officials, that we can use the German universal jurisdiction, or that we push at the UN level for these special sessions, or, for example, as well, these structural investigations. Thank you very much, Gisu. Now, coming to Mahsa, first of all, of course, is there something to add what you would like to see that European governments or the US is doing to to protect, support digital freedoms of Iranians? And is there maybe other means that we can rather equip activists with the right tools to counter the censorship and to, of course, prevent this looming online isolation of Iranian civil society?
So I agree with everything that Gisu said in terms of the UN mechanism and the investigations, because all of those efforts to highlight the human rights crimes, if not possible, crimes against humanity that are occurring in Iran, will underscore the deterioration of access to the internet and freedom of expression issues that are kind of core and complementary to all those other human rights abuses that are going on. So Germany's leadership and push for that is really paramount. So just to reemphasize that, in terms of how to empower with technology, there is a lot of room for US technology companies, but I guess in terms of Germany and European countries, they host a lot of offices and bases for some of these important technology companies. So these initiatives are very important, empowering Iranians with more circumvention technology. Like both Felicia and I highlighted, the assault on circumvention technology by the Iranian authorities, possibly even using very sophisticated Chinese technology, means that nation state resources are being put into really debilitating the ability for Iranians to access a free and secure internet. And so there really needs to be nation state level resources and development in terms of circumvention technology by the companies. And so, one of the big asks we have is, how can companies like Google and Amazon that have nation state level resources be contributing to this, and how can they be developing and furthering this cause? Of course, at Google, there's the human rights arm Jigsaw that has been developing Outline, which is great. But there's so much more that can be done, especially now that the technology sanctions aren't there, in terms of ensuring that Google Cloud platforms and AWS can start aiding into the circumvention fight. Google's own Jigsaw's Outline VPN sometimes needs to be distributed through cloud infrastructure in order for to host the proxy connections, and they can't even rely on GCP, Google Cloud platforms. They have to rely on things like DigitalOcean, which have been unblocked in Iran. So this will provide, a significant form of resistance for this circumvention battle, essentially, or this cat and mouse game that requires enormous amounts of resources and development. Re-enabling things like domain fronting, which used to be a way that cloud service providers could provide a different method for circumvention. Of course, domain fronting is how Signal used to provide circumvention for access to its tool in countries where it was blocked. They used domain fronting through Google's App Engine to make Signal available in countries like Egypt, where it was blocked. Could not work in Iran, obviously, because at that time, Google App Engine was blocked in Iran. And so these things really need to empower what we're trying to do. Those are some of the very high-level recommendations I have to this, beyond the kind of human rights documentation and accountability work that Gisu has been touching on.
Thank you very much, Mahsa, and also really thank you for the work that you're doing within Article 19 together with Access Now and others, which is basically, supporting all these activists on the ground and making it possible that there is some circumvention technologies in place, maybe not enough, but at least some. Coming to you, Felicia, maybe you could talk a little bit more on the Keep It On campaign and what we or you as civil society actors like Access Now or others can do to fight internet shutdowns in Iran and in other places? How can we more effectively advocate against it and embrace digital rights for everyone?
I think we need to continue talking about the issue and how much it threatens fundamental human rights across the world. And that is something that is at the core of the Keep It On campaign. We do raise awareness wherever internet shutdowns are happening, and we do provide support to people to be able to bypass internet shutdowns. And I think through the coalition, which connects us to diverse partners on the ground that are able to guide and provide context when it comes to issues happening in around the world, I think that is something that has really been the strength of the campaign since it was launched. And so we continue to do this. In raising awareness, we also have seen how powerful it is to use stories to situate what we mean by internet shutdowns and the impacts that they are having on fundamental rights and how they disrupt people's lives. And so under the Shutdown Tracker, Shutdown Impact Stories project, we continue to highlight how internet shutdowns affect people. And before this shutdown began in Iran, for instance, we did speak with a number of women in Iran to highlight how the previous shutdowns in the country have affected their businesses as well as their economic activities, and just how much it has disrupted their dependence on the internet, if I would put it. And so I think this is an aspect of the campaign that we really need everyone's support to be able to collect stories, to share your stories with us, so we can use that to raise awareness. And some of these stories are used as testimonies during litigation cases against shutdowns, which brings me to another strategy we use in fighting shutdowns. Strategic litigation has been very crucial in our fight against internet shutdowns, with some successes recorded in Togo, in Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Zambia, India, and other countries around the world. And so doing this, we provide the judges that sit on these cases with amicus briefs to understand what exactly an internet shutdown is, since some of them are not able to situate and understand what we mean by that. And so we provide case studies to provide them with more information and understanding about what internet shutdowns refer to. And then since the start of the protests and digital repression in Iran, as I said, we continue to work closely with our partners to be able to highlight and amplify information that they are able to access out of Iran. And then one big aspect as well is the measurement community and the contribution they provide for this campaign. So the measurement community enable us to be able to document and monitor the technical evidence of shutdowns as they happen. And they also help us to maintain our global shutdown tracker optimization database, which contains data on internet shutdowns we've documented since 2016. And we'll be working on this year's annual report as well. And usually the annual report is to highlight the trends, the case studies we've observed within the year, and some of the advocacy strategies that we did use in pushing back against shutdowns. And I think one recommendation I would want to make is that various stakeholders like the UN, the EU, the Freedom Online Coalition, as well as researchers and academia should continue to speak up on this issue. And we've seen the EU, for instance, and the Freedom Online Coalition issuing statements to condemn the Iran shutdown and urge authorities to bring an end to that. And I think this is something we want to see more of it, that governments that are in touch with these regimes that continue to impose internet shutdowns would leverage that to condemn these acts and call them to order whenever the internet is disrupted, among other digital rights violations that happen. And of course, we still need support to be able to continue the work that we are doing. So civil society need the support, both financially and resources, to be able to continue this work. And so I would say that let's continue to provide this to these communities and the civil society groups that are focusing on these issues, as well as the measurement community that continue to provide these technical evidence for us to use for our advocacy purposes. And then finally, Access Now's digital security helpline has also been very instrumental in providing technical assistance on digital security as well as circumvention tools. And it's important for people that use these tools to seek expert advice when, for instance, choosing the VPNs to ensure that they are safe and they prevent them from getting into further trouble or danger during internet shutdowns. So these are some of the recommendations I want to leave. And if there are any participants from civil society that would want to be part of the Keep It On coalition, I see our website has been shared in the chat. And so please feel free to reach out, and then we can connect and see how we can continue to push back against internet shutdowns around the world.
Thank you, Felicia, and all the best for the Keep It On campaign, because I think it's really important to understand that digital rights is not only something for people that are interested into tech, but it's really something for anyone who's interested in human rights and civil liberties. And the bigger this coalition will be, the better. Thank you all for this discussion on the panel. Now I would like to open and give some of the questions we have received from the audience to you. We might not be able to answer all of them, but I will try my very best. And of course, if you have more of them, please still use a Q&A tool. First of all, I would maybe give 3 questions, and then you feel free to which of them you want to react. So one of them is from an anonymous participant. How do we need to modify sanctions in order for them to punish the Iranian authorities for their violations of digital rights? So is there basically smarter, different sanctions that I mean European governments and the US can use to, in a more targeted way, punish those individuals or organizations that are responsible for the internet censorship? Then I have a second one from Jean-Philippe Barg, who is from the Taz, the German newspaper, who is basically asking about the impact of this national information network. So basically the national internet that Iran tries to build. And he's asking if you think that Iran would be really capable of implementing this full scale, like China with its Great Firewall, or wouldn't the economic repercussion be not too big if you really would implement this national internet consequently? I don't know if you have an assessment on this. And then last but not least, for this first round, I have more practical question from Reza, who has asked if it's legally possible to basically host VPNs from Germany or other European countries to support activists in Iran, and if there would be any problem doing even crowdfunding, having the US financial sanctions in place if you want to support VPN solutions. So is there any legal problems with European or US laws if you want to do these kind of things? So I would say you pick and choose what you want to react to, and whoever want to start starts.
Sure. I can. I think Gishu might be the best in terms of modifying sanctions to target the regime, but I can approach the question about VPNs and sanctions. So there are no sanctions on providing VPN services. I mean, that has always been exempt. Even 10 years ago, providing VPN services to Iran has always been exempt and is not illegal. Of course, if you wanted to send money to Iran for someone in Iran to develop the proxy, you would find difficulties in terms of that kind of movement of financial transactions. But of course, if you wanted to build a VPN, its server and everything is hosted in Germany, for Iranians to use, there's no restrictions on that. And in fact, I encourage anyone who has that kind of technical ability or savvy, who has servers or has that kind of capacity or resources to do. And of course, for the VPNs to be secure and safe. And there's a number of, safe and secure open source protocols that people can use. So yeah, if you do have a safe and secure means of providing circumvention tools that work for Iranians, there are no restrictions legally on it. In fact, it should be encouraged. More people should be doing it because there's over 60 million internet users in Iran, and there certainly are not enough functional circumvention tools. So please, by any means, get involved in that. That's just my reaction to that.
I don't know, do you want to respond as well to this national information network and how realistic
yes.
it could be that this is really implemented full scale?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, one of the reasons why we haven't seen the kind of international shutdowns that we saw in 2019, I mean, I assume this is one of the reasons, is because of the economic impacts. So, and I don't believe the Islamic Republic has quite solved this issue. I think they're still grappling with this problem, because even when they went and they temporarily blocked Instagram and WhatsApp, they are still discussing whether or not that temporary ban is going to become permanent, because so much money and so many opportunities and so many industries depend on Instagram. So the latest research actually coming out of Iran before the protests indicated that Instagram contributed something like $1 billion into the US economy into the Iranian economy every year. And so there has been no viable alternative that anyone trusts or uses to Instagram. So, I mean, they've been trying with the alternative Rubica, and Rubica obviously is hosted on the National Information Network, but they have yet to find a way for users to build that trust, to buy into their systems. This just has not occurred. So, this is an issue they're grappling with. And, I hope they never solve this issue, because the alternatives, obviously, I have been very hard pressed to find anyone who wants to buy into a system like Rubica. Obviously, there have been other technologies and applications in Iran that have been nationally developed and work with authorities that have had buy-in, but they're mainly services that you cannot get from foreign alternatives. So as long as foreign alternatives like Instagram and WhatsApp exist, these are international services. For things that are a bit more local, for example, for the alternative to Amazon, Digicala. Obviously, because of the limits on financial transactions and because Amazon isn't there, the local alternative has really thrived. And there's been a lot of information about how they cooperate with the state. Another local alternative to Uber, Snap. And they have, the Uber Eats version, Snap Eats. It's been well documented, and I think I saw someone in the questions even mention this. It's been well documented how this technology is being abused by authorities to surveil individuals, to help locate them and to help arrest them. So these are the local technologies that people had to buy into, because there really are no alternatives for, you know, local food delivery and things like that. There is a surge and there is a lot of campaigning right now to get folks in Iran to divest from these services. But and of course, people should, you know, not allow their, you know, data and information like that to be monitored by such a repressive state. But there is an issue of, you know, what are the alternatives? There are no real technological alternatives. There would have to be, you know, like offline traditional alternatives to walking and getting your food, as opposed to relying on technology for things like that.
Thank you for your explanations, and hopefully this vision of the national internet never comes true as the regime envisioned it. So Gisu, maybe you can come in on this smart targeted sanctions. Is there still room for these kind of sanctions?
Yeah, so just a quick point on that. What is interesting is, so my team is putting together targeted human rights sanctions packages, and the focus for us is really who has assets within the jurisdictions that would issue these targeted sanctions, because it's not super helpful. It's great in a symbolic sense, sure, but it's not super helpful when there are targeted human rights sanctions on individuals who never leave Iran, who have no assets outside of Iran, who are never going to travel outside of Iran. We're focused more on the asset freezing part of it, with the vision that eventually we can seize the assets, which as of now is, you know, not a widely accepted practice across these country situations. We saw some uptick of interest in this after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I think, you know, folks probably remember the very flashy seizing of oligarch yachts and trying to look at how those could be repurposed to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine post-war. But there's some things that we're exploring right now with that regard. Now, in order to even get to the seizure question, you actually have to freeze assets. And I will tell you that there is lots of information that our team gets about individuals that might be affiliated with an IRGC-controlled business, or who have some sort of loose connection to IRGC-affiliated individuals, who might be their children. And it can be very hard to get a targeted sanctions designation on those folks, because it doesn't necessarily have a strong link to gross human rights violations, which would be this, you know, the standard under, or serious human rights abuses, rather, that would be the standard under Executive Order 13553 in the US, which is really operative for a lot of these targeted sanctions. But where there's actually a lot more leeway for us, and where we actually are able to issue the most packages, has to do with EO 13846, which authorizes sanctions on persons who engage in censorship or other activities with respect to Iran. So that would be linked to cutting off the internet or restricting the internet, of course. And also EO 13606, which authorizes sanctions with respect to grave human rights abuses by the governments of Iran and Syria via information technology. So again, there's that tech component. So these targeted sanctions categories are actually a lot more expansive than what my team is dealing with when we're looking at alleged torturers, alleged perpetrators of crimes against humanity. And so that's kind of the interesting thing about it. Now, they could obviously be used to much more further effect. We saw that a recent raft of designations have come from USG, from the US government, on individuals who play a role in that internet suppression and control of the online space. So that's very welcome. But, you know, it can go a lot farther. And I think in the case of Europe, definitely, because we saw that the EU just issued its first raft of targeted human rights sanctions, its first updated raft since 2013. And that's almost a decade. So yeah, there's a whole list of things that could be done. I would definitely, since there may be some folks who are in Europe in the crowd, I would definitely encourage sort of engagement with the EU, the UK, and also on an individual national level, to the extent that there are individuals that are suspected to have assets in these jurisdictions and who might play a role in the control of the online space, to really push for designations. But you know, I would say that sometimes they can actually be more expansive than the designations that we need for really brutal core atrocity crimes and things like that, where it's not as easy to actually bring a targeted designation for somebody who's aiding and abetting those crimes, for instance.
Thank you very much, Disu, for explaining this targeted sanctions approach, and also, yeah, the room for maneuver that especially the European countries, the EU, still have in listing more individuals and especially targeting people who are involved into internet censorship. Felicia, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, just I agree with everything that has been said, but also to just use the recent example from the UK, when the UK government listened to civil society. Civil society's assertion that blocking the information flow in and out of Russia would also be a blow on the rights of millions of people affected by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And so in the end, they did not impose blanket sanctions, but then they allowed information flow to continue to go through Russia, so that people can also have access to the global internet as well as media services. And this is directly in line with the US administration's issuance of General License 25A, which also kind of restored access to certain communication technology platforms and instant messaging, as well as video conferencing in Iran, to enable people to be able to continue sending information out. And so this are some of the ways that we can make sanctions targeted and also allow citizens to benefit and continue to use these digital technologies for their various work and needs.
Thank you very much, Felicia. And looking at the time, I would like to close the event, even though we have not answered all the questions, but some of them are very specific and might go a little bit beyond what we can answer right now. I would first of all like to thank our three panelists. Thank you so much for being with us and for giving us all these pieces of information, explanation, and at least me, I feel like I have a clearer vision what is possible, what we can do on different levels as citizens, as civil society, but also what we can ask for vis-a-vis politicians, governments in Europe and the US. And I can only encourage everyone in the audience to follow closely what Access Now, Article 19, Atlantic Councils and others are doing. I think there is wonderful resources out there, and sometimes it's more a matter of using them and bringing them to the right people and yeah, pushing for something to happen. And of course, at the same time, seeing that we can do what we can do at our end to support the digital rights of activists, of citizens in Iran that are still protesting, that are still going to the streets, and that are still asking for change. So thank you all, and I don't know if there's anything that hasn't been said that you want to add, please feel free to come in. But from my side, there is only a big thank you, and maybe also just the information that the session is recorded and will be published on the YouTube channel of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, so you could also share it later on or look at it again in case you want to.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for following us. Have a nice evening, and yeah, I can only stay committed, and of course, yeah, stay solidaric with the movement, with the protesters in Iran, and yeah.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much for the excellent moderation as well.